Hello everyone. Thank you for tuning in. I am Jay Lee. This is Jay Lee's Corner, and this is my review for Greenleaf Season 2, Episode 9. Now, this is the second half of Greenleaf. We know Season 2 did start, I think in maybe March, and then it went on hiatus in May. So this is the second half to Season 2. So, people might have thought, oh, it's Episode 1 of Season 2. But no, it's just the second half of Season 2. But as we all know, first things first, if you have not done so already, please take a moment and subscribe to my channel. I keep hiccuping in my throat. It doesn't cost you anything. It just lets you know when I have new content available on my channel. And as I say every time, I love new subscribers. And yes, as always, I'm moving stuff around. You can also like my videos, share my videos, and there is a comment section below. You can put your comments, but the only rule to the comment section is please be respectful. So please and thank you, and subscribe. So let's see where it starts off. So season does start off right where the last episode left off from. Gigi, Grace, and Mac, her uncle, the pedophile, is at his apartment fighting, and he was choking her out, and she stabs him in the neck. So he is basically laying on the ground, holding his neck, bleeding, saying, call the police. And she's like, no, where's my daughter? Where's Sophia? Because as we recall from the last episode, she thought Mac had done something to Sophia when actually Sophia was hanging out with her cousin. I can't think of what her cousin's name is. But, Grace kept calling her daughter. Her daughter wasn't answering the phone. And then Mac called Grace and was like, you think it ain't going to be no consequences? Do you messing in my business? And she's like, what did you do? And he's like, oh, it's too late now. So she assumed he had done something to her daughter, and he had went over there. So she went there thinking he had done something. So she's saying, where's my daughter? Where is she? And Mac is still saying, call the police. I don't know where she is. I'm sorry. And he basically bleeds out. She kind of wakes up from her, I would say, I feel like she blacked out a little bit to where she didn't realize how bad it was. And, but at the same time, she kind of murdered him. He's basically dying. And she calls 911 at that particular time. And she's like, I need an ambulance. So the next thing we see is her sitting like on the outside of the ambulance, outside of the building, and the police officer is questioning her. Just asking her, what did he ask her? Just random questions like, you guys friends? And she's like, why would you ask me that? And he's like, I'm just trying to figure out, why he would let you in. And she's like, well, he didn't. And then the cop was like, so you barged your way in? She's like, no, he opened the door and I walked in. And basically she's saying, are you trying to say that I killed him? And he's like, you barged in, you went over there, you stabbed him, and now he's dead. So, yes, in my head, I think you murdered him. It did cross my mind. We do see the body being carried out, so that whole thing happens. And she's looking at his dead body because she literally killed her uncle, who was a pedophile, who molested her sister, and who knows how many other females. So the next thing we see is Kevin, who is Charity's husband, who thinks he's gay. He wakes up in the bed with his male lover, Aaron, who is the new lawyer at the church's office. Also the son to a friend of the family. And, he basically is sitting there in the bed, and he, the guy's sitting next to him, he's just looking up at, he's just looking up. And, he hear his son crying because he's at home. His son's in the other room, and he has the baby monitor right there. And he gets up and goes in with his child. He's like, I got you, son. And he's cradling his son. But my thing is, you really slept with this man in your family's home. Okay, I'm not even gonna go there. Aaron does wake up to see that Kevin is gone. He's not in the room. My thing is, as I said before, I had nothing against gay, lesbian, bisexual, trisexual, whatever. But if you are gay, you should not sleep with a man in the home of your wife or your ex-wife when your child is there. Like, especially if you don't want people to find out. I mean, if you're going to live in your truth, then live in your truth and do whatever. But, you know, it's just a time and a place for everything. So, but again, you know, I'm not going to get into that. We see next Grace is at the hospital. She's getting photos taken of her bruises. I mean, she is bruised up. I mean, cuts and bruises on her hands, her arms, her neck, her back, her legs. She was definitely, it definitely shows she was definitely in the fight for her life. So, the male cop still, you know, he's there too. And, you know, as she's taking the pictures and they're saying, you know, turn to your left, show us your hands, you know, show us your neck, show us your back, you know, lift your hair up, you know, hold your hands out, show us your knees. And all over her body is bruises. And as she's each picture, you know, she's kind of taking it all in, trying to breathe, but she's also crying because she was still in this horrific situation. Even though she killed her uncle, who was a pedophile, so, you know, she was still not prepared for this altercation. So for her, she killed someone. So it's still a shock to her system. Not only that, she's badly beaten. So it's also that with it as well. They tell her that, you know, she's free to go, that she's not under arrest. But of course, they'll be in contact with her. You know, her mom and her dad, Bishop and May, are in the lobby waiting. And, you know, May starts talking. And I think it was about to be like a good memory of Mac, her brother, who's the person that Gigi has killed. And, you know, Bishop was like, May, you know, we sitting here waiting on our daughter who almost died. You know, excuse me if I don't want to hear a fond memory of the man who tried to murder her, your brother. And she kind of be quiet, basically. So, you know, Gigi comes out, and her mom, her dad see her for the first time. And even though she has clothes on, you can still see her face is bruised. So she, you know, they can see that she was hurt. And, you know, she hugs Bishop. And May, you know, her and her mom has not had the best relationship. And, you know, May says, you know, I know you must read my, you know, natural reserve as judgment. Because as we know, May is always calm, cool, and collected. So sometimes that can come off as cold and not give a fuck. I'm trying not to cuss as much in this vlog because it's, you know, about a church. So, but, you know, you say you might read my reserve as judgment. But let me be clear. You know, I'm happy you're alive. You know, I don't blame you at all. I know it was self-defense. And she's looking at her daughter and talking directly to her daughter. So let her daughter know what keeps beeping? I keep hearing stuff beep. I'm like, I don't know if it's my phone, my iPod, my iPad, my laptop. Just so many goddamn electronics. Anywho, she, you know, was talking to her daughter, just saying how she's, you know, she doesn't blame her for the fact that her brother is dead. She doesn't blame her for going there, and she doesn't blame her for killing him. And you know how she know it was self-defense. And she's like, you know, Mama, it was, saying it really was self-defense. And in reality, it really was self-defense. You know, even in the back of her mind, she might have always wanted him dead. But in the situation of when she murdered him, they were really fighting, and she was really fighting for her life. And when he was choking her, she did grab the bottle and she stabbed him. But, you know, she thought she was going to die. And then, you know, May says, I love you. And then Grace says back, I love you too, Mama. And, you know, they all embrace, you know, Grace, Gigi, May, and Bishop. The next scene is we see Grace, you know, she goes home. She sees her daughter on the couch because, again, she thought Mac had her daughter. So she's happy to know her daughter is at home and she's safe. So she wakes her daughter up. And her daughter sees her, and of course her daughter looks frightened because her mom is beaten. And as a daughter, oh my God, I would go crazy. And she's like, I'm okay, baby. You know, I'm okay. And of course they hug. You know, it cuts to a scene of May and Bishop talking about how they were gonna call Jacob, who was the other brother. They wouldn't call Charity yet, who was the other sister, because she's out of town. But they're like, you know how she hates feeling like people leave her out. But they're like, she's out of town. It's something that she can do from where she is, and I don't want to worry her. So we'll call her and tell her tomorrow. We next see, I need to drink some water, Grace talking to Sophia. And she's basically asking her, where were you? Why didn't you answer your phone? I was so worried about you. Baby, where were you? And she's like, she was with a cousin. She called me for a ride and my phone died. And that's why I wasn't able to answer. She's like, but it's not my fault that you went there and did whatever you did. Now, see, for me, I would never say that to my mama. You know what I'm saying? I can't imagine if my mom came to me and said, well, if I found out my mother murdered a family member who was molesting people and she was beaten for it, and if she went there thinking the person had harmed me, my response would never be, if my mom was saying, well, where were you? I went there looking for you. I would never take my parents saying that as saying it's your fault I did that, unless they said that out her mouth, and that's not what she said. She was just wondering where, I was so frightened, that's why I went there, but not that it's your fault that I went there. And she's like, I didn't say that it was your fault. I was just worried about you. I would move heaven and earth for you. And she's like, are you going to jail? And she's like, I don't know, but it was self-defense, honey. And her daughter was like, yeah, I know. That whole scene to me was kind of telling. In different ways. One, it showed how protective Grace is of her daughter, as any mother would be. But it also showed a question of, did my mom murder somebody for me? It was a different whole little thing or whatnot. The next they showed Grace just taking a shower. And it was a scene that I thought was great simply because it showed her taking off her clothes. They didn't show her body or anything. But as she's pulling her clothes off, you see every bruise. You hear her having to strain to take off clothes and how she's looking at her body. And she's seeing the bruises from this altercation. And she gets in the shower, of course, to wash all the blood and just the day off. And she's crying in the shower. It's just that first relief of, I'm alive, he isn't, I survived. But also, I murdered someone. Am I happy he's dead? Am I sad he's dead? Can I live with being a murderer? All these emotions I felt like came out in her when she was crying. The next thing that we see is she's waking up the next morning and her phone is ringing. And it's Darius calling her. Darius is the guy who she likes. He's the reporter guy. He's played by Rick Fox. And she's kind of ignoring phone calls. I would be too, because I would be tired. It cuts to a scene of Jacob, the brother, talking to his wife basically about going to talk to Bishop. Basically because, him and Bishop has this kind of, dysfunctional relationship where he doesn't feel like Bishop accepts him as a pastor. But Bishop doesn't, because he feels like Jacob didn't always want to be a pastor. But anywho, they're basically talking because he wants to go talk to the bishop about the lands he now has and his wife owns, if they can kind of get that figured out. The next thing we see is May and Bishop talking the following morning. Bishop is saying how they're going to have to try to figure out how to have the conversation with the deacons of the church. And May is like, we're going to have Grace, she's going to go to work as normal. She's going to go to work with her head held high. She's not going to be ashamed of what she did. Nothing happened. That was a scandal. There would be no scandal. And Mac is like, May, Mac is dead. Grace killed him. She had motive and opportunity. It's going to be a scandal. And she's like, it was self-defense. She's a hero. The Lord gave her the strength to come out of that situation. Grace comes out and hear her mom say she's a hero. And she's like, I'm a hero. And she's like, yeah. You did what you had to do. It was self-defense, and that's all that matters. We then see Aaron come out, and the first thing he says is, hey, have you guys seen Kevin? You looking for your gay lover? He left already, sir. He went to the church. So, yeah, that scene happened earlier, but it was so quick, I didn't want to talk about it. So from that, we do see the bishop gets up to go to church to prepare himself to talk to the deacons. And, May is talking to Grace and just saying, the Lord knows what he's doing. Hold your head up high. You are not a victim. It was self-defense, And she's like, don't give an inch today. Don't you apologize. Don't you have any regrets. What you did was fine. What else do we see? What happened next? We see Charity, who's still out of town. She does not know anything that's happened. She don't know that her sister has killed her uncle. She's still flirting with that man who helped her produce some songs. We ain't gonna talk about that just yet. And, when he's like, okay, let's go talk to the singers or whenever that's in the studio session, she's like, well, no, let me call home first. I want to talk to Kevin to be sure the baby's okay. So when she calls home, of course, Kevin answers. And, Kevin is like, oh, the baby is fine. And she's like, what do you mean by that? What's not fine? And she's like, he says, well, your mother didn't want me to tell you, but I know how you hate being left out, or being the last one to know something. And she's like, well, what happened? So, he did tell her that, Gigi went to see your uncle last night and there was an altercation. She's like, Kevin, what happened? What's wrong? And he's like, Mac is dead. And of course, she's like, oh my God, I can't believe it. I have to come home. And she then is like, I'm happy we can kind of be friends and, be co-parenting, even though we didn't work out. So on her end, she's kind of emotional because one, her uncle was dead. Her sister was, in an altercation. But she's happy that her and Kevin are able to have this kind of friendly relationship. He's on the other line of the phone. He crying. I feel like he crying because he slept with a man. Because if you recall, that's the first time that that's the first time that Kevin has been with a man. He never acted on his urges of being gay. So for him, I'm pretty sure it's a lot going on in his head. So I think he's crying because he's like, I can't go back to who I used to be in one way or the other. We do see that Jacob comes to the church. He sees Grace. He's hugging her. He's glad she's okay. He walks her to her office. Lets her know that he's there to talk to their father. But also says, someone's in your office who wants to talk to you. And we see it's Darius, the Rick Fox character, waiting on her. And, she walks in, they embrace, and he's, just hugging her like, oh my God, what happened? Are you okay? You see him kind of look her over to see all of her bruises and everything. We see a scene also of May trying to call her sister, Mavis, who's played by Oprah. But Mavis doesn't answer, so her voicemail comes on. But that's not a message you leave on a voicemail. As I said before, there's a couple of things you can't do by phone or voicemail or text. Is if somebody's dead and if you're breaking up with someone. So, you can't leave your sibling a message on their voicemail that their other sibling is dead. Unless, you at least leave a message say, hey, we had a family emergency. I need you to call me back. She could at least said that, but she didn't say anything. She just hung up the phone. We see Gigi and Darius talking, and, she's telling him how she still has to talk to the police, because they still think it might not be self-defense. And he's like, it's clearly self-defense. Look at your wounds, your scars, prove it. And she's like, yeah, I just have to, get through this, to get through it. And, he's hugging her. And what I felt like the hug was, I felt like she felt safe. I felt like, in that moment, it wasn't anything sexual. It was just a man, knowing she felt vulnerable or knowing that she felt stressed. I can't think of a good word right now because it's 1:40 in the morning. But, he hugged her to make her feel comfortable, to let her guard down a little bit and to take a sigh of release. I thought that part was cool. We do see the scene of Jacob finally talking to Bishop. And he's basically saying, hey, this is the deed to the land that we were all fighting over before. And he's like, how do you know this is really legit? How do you know he's not playing you in some kind of way? He put all these stunts before. The last time y'all was here, y'all was in here talking about holding me up and, holding all the stuff up in court and keeping stuff in litigation. So, how do you know this is not another plan of his? He's like, nope, this is completely legit. We own the land. It's ours. It's ours. It's ours. And he's like, look, this is what I think we should be able to do. We have the land now. We can do whatever we want on this land. How about we co-pastor the church? We switch off Sundays, and we build whatever we want on the land across the street. He like co-pastors, and he's like, yeah, you take one Sunday, I take one Sunday. He like, look, we're gonna have it my way. I don't need a, he's like, I don't need a co-pastor. I need a co-pastor as much as I need a cane to walk, and he don't need no cane to walk. So he like, I don't need no co-pastor. Meaning, I still don't want you as a pastor in this church, for his own different reasons. So yeah, that's kind of how that scene ended, of him saying, I don't need a co-pastor. So that was his way of saying no to your deal. We then see how Aaron calls Kevin, leaving Kevin a message, just asking him if he's okay, if he's cool, because again, he hasn't talked to Kevin since they had sex. Because when he woke up, Kevin was gone. We see Gigi going to talk to the police, and Aaron is with her. And as they're walking up, Aaron is kind of coaching her on what to say. He's not telling her to lie, but he's trying to help her, because as we know, the police can sometimes take your response and take an answer and make it mean something completely different. Like when she was talking and saying, he was choking me and, I couldn't breathe, so I grabbed the bottle. And he's like, no, don't say that. You have to say you fear for your life, you felt like you were going to die, and that's why you grabbed the bottle. It means the same thing, but it all depends on how you say it, on how the police can twist it. So she repeats it and says it the way that he wants her to say it. She then talks about what happened after she grabbed the bottle. I grabbed the bottle, I stabbed him in the neck, and he started bleeding out. And he's like, you can't say that. And she's like, why not? And he's like, because remember, you told the police you didn't remember what happened after you picked up the bottle. So you can't start changing your story. And she's like, okay, fine. He like, if you didn't remember then, you can't remember now. Don't start remembering things now. So when she's in there talking to the cop is like, so you grabbed the bottle, right? And she's like, yeah, I feared for my life. He was choking me. I thought I was going to die, so I grabbed the bottle. And then he's like, and then what happened? She's like, well, I don't remember. And then he made a comment about Flint water. You must be drinking the Flint water because it's giving you amnesia. I don't know how I feel about that. I stay in Detroit. I think the Flint water crisis is a very, very serious thing. I don't think it's anything to joke about. I also don't think that's something that anyone should say to someone else who is, can't remember something, because there are people in Flint who are really affected, who had to drink that damn poisonous ass water, and it's still something that's affecting them today. So I almost didn't find it funny, but I also feel like maybe they threw that in there for awareness for Flint water, so maybe if people watch the show, they can say, what are they talking about? And they can Google Flint water and then figure out what's happening, and then maybe donate. So I see it both ways. Anywho, when the cop then asked her, well, what did you stabbed him in the neck and he was bleeding out. And she's like, yeah, but I don't remember what else happened. He's like, well, when did you call the police? And she's like, what? And he's like, how long after you picked the bottle up did you call the police? And then Aaron was like, this interview is over. And then the cop was like, yep, it's over because I just ended it. Meaning she ain't talking no more, so go ahead on. They show a scene of Jacob talking with his wife, letting her know that his dad basically said no. And she's like, look, we don't have enough money to build on the land, and we can't survive off just my income, and Bishop doesn't want you to be co-pastor. We need to figure something else out. She then suggests, hey, how about we call, she said the guy's name, but it's a TV producer who wanted Jacob to do a TV show, a pastor type or church type show in part 1 of season 2. But that same producer wanted to sleep with his wife. And, he's like, look, I don't want to, do that. I don't want to call him. And she's like, well, why not? He wanted you on the show. And he's like, I don't know if I can work with a person who approached my wife like that. Like, I can't do that. How can I work with a man who wanted to sleep with my wife? Who wanted to sleep with my wife? And she's basically making him a sandwich. And then she's like, here, my man can't be hungry when he's trying to figure stuff out. He then says he has an idea. He does not elaborate on what the idea is, so we have to wait to figure that out. we do see Grace who go talks to Bishop, and she's like, look, if they arrest me, I need you to try your hardest to get custody of Sophia. I know for a fact, her father would try to get custody of her, and I don't want her away from the family. And he's like, that won't happen. It won't come to that. We'll move heaven and earth for you. And then she's like, I wish I had, your faith. And he's like, I wish you did too. Just meaning, he believes wholeheartedly that everything will be okay. And she doesn't all the way believe that. So, yeah. We then see Kevin, who's pissed off because he slept with Aaron. And he goes to his Don't Be Gay Anymore meeting to say, he's, it's like a Don't Be Gay club, which is stupid. He walks in, he's like, this is a lie, it's all a lie. It doesn't work, I'm driving myself crazy. I feel like people need to figure out who they are. Y'all are lying to yourself. And he's kind of going off, and the conductor of the group is like, what's wrong? Calm down. I know it's not that easy. It takes step by step. It doesn't work overnight. You have to do the work to be able to change who you are. And Kevin is like, you're a liar. And he storms out because he's pissed off. So we like, yeah. Okay. And, some people are gay. Some people are gay, and they turn out to not be gay. For whatever the reasons may be. I'm going to leave it at that. We see Grace, who's at the church, and she's talking to God, basically, at this point in time. She's apologizing for, she's like, I'm sorry for trying to do the right thing. And then she's just saying to him, you know my heart, Lord. You know my heart. You know my heart. Meaning, I did something horrible, but you know my heart. I did something unthinkable, but you know my heart. And she's like, but just don't take my daughter away. I don't know if she was saying that as in, you know my heart, I'm a great person, I didn't mean to do this, or you know my heart, it was an accident, I wanted it to happen, I'm sorry it happened, but I'm a good person, Lord. I see it can be both ways. And her thing is, she was trying to say, don't punish me for what I did because I didn't mean to do it, is what I kind of took from it. So don't punish me by taking my daughter away. We do see that Charity does come home, finally. And she is meeting with Gigi, May, and Bishop. And she's like, I'm so glad you're okay. And, they're like, well, sit down and tell us how your trip went. And she's like, well, I feel awkward, because everything that went on. She sees the cuts and bruises on her sister, and she's like, oh, my God. And Grace is like, no, we need some really good news, so how did it go? And she looked like she had a good time because she was over there flirting with that man. She said she had a great time. The group performing her songs, want her to do more songs, and she just had a good time. Again, because she over there flirting with that man. That's the whole conversation with them, and she then goes up to try to see Kevin and the baby, because of course she's back in town. When she goes up, she does not find Kevin. She does find their maid, who's like, well, Kevin asked me to watch him until you get home. And she's like, okay, cool, thank you so much. And then when she walks up to the baby's crib, there's a note for her on the crib, and of course it's probably from Kevin. So she opens it and she reads it. Now, we don't know what it said, but it took her breath away for her to be like, Kevin. Now, is it a suicide? Is it a suicide note? Did he admit that he slept with the guy, Aaron? I want to know what the note said. I'm assuming it wasn't a suicide note solely because if it was, I felt like she would have reacted to try to find him and let her family know we need to find Kevin that's trying to kill himself. So I'm guessing he maybe admitted that he acted on his homosexual urges. And maybe that's what it is. And that's why it took her breath away. So the last 2-ish scenes of the episode, Bishop and May are talking, and May is saying how Mac wasn't always a monster. She then tells the story of them being there with their father, and Mac was getting upset because their father cracked a joke about taking the kids to a bar so that he can get drunk. And she's like, he got mad the whole day. He was just so upset. He didn't get that daddy was just joking and nothing about nothing about that day, you know, his mood didn't change. And, you know, she was kind of laughing about it. And then she said, you know, I really believe, you know, maybe Mac was the way he was because he saw what our father did. You know, he saw what he did to me. And as she said that, Bishop turned and slowly turned and looked at her, you know, because Bishop didn't know her father, you know, basically molested her as a child. So she felt like the reason her brother became a monster is because her brother started to see what their father did to her, which made him do it to other kids. And that's how he ended up becoming a monster eventually. And again, Bishop never knew that May was molested by her father. So, of course, he hugged her, and you're like, oh, May, oh, Lord. You know, he's comforting her. Lastly, we see, you know, Aaron coming to Gigi's room, letting her know the prosecutors are not going to prosecute her or press charges against her. And she's like, well, why not? And he's like, what do you mean, why not? And she's like, well, they were so convinced that I murdered him. Why did they change their mind? And he's like, well, you know the saying, sometimes the bear gets you, but sometimes you get the bear. I've never heard that saying before, but I'm going to start using it. You know what I'm saying? This meaning, you know, you lucky. You know, the bear didn't get you, you got the bear, so you off the hook. You know, leave it at that. The last scene is Grace at like the water's edge of their home, and she's looking over the water, and then you hear Mac's voice basically in her head. She hears the voice, and she kind of turns to look, and of course he's not there because he's dead. And he says, you know how many times I prayed not to go to jail? Hundreds. And to me, that was the thing of every time he did something wrong, every time he molested someone, he prayed not to go to jail. So he's saying you did something wrong and you prayed not to go to jail and you didn't go to jail. And that's how the episode went off. So for the most part, the first episode of this part 2 of season 2 was really, really good. I love Greenleaf. I feel like it's a story told in a great way. It addresses different issues as far as, you know, gay people in the church, molestation, just custody battles, marriage issues, money issues, you know, just everything about life a little bit, you know, sibling issues, sibling rivalries, just all that kind of stuff, divorce, marriage, everything. So, you know, I'm a Greenleaf fan. I will be reviewing the show every week. And I am Jay Lee. This is Jay Lee's Corner. This is my review for Greenleaf Season 2, Episode 9. And until next time, people,